Okay, so in this class, we're going to be discussing W.E.B. Du Bois and Frantz Fanon. We'll be giving particular attention to Du Bois. Du Bois was born in 1868 in Massachusetts. He was the first American sociologist that we are covering, is the first American sociologist we're covering this semester. Um, the previous sociologists that we've discussed have all been from Europe. He was the first African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard. He was one of the founders of the NAACP, and he served as a professor in Georgia at Atlanta University, now Clark Atlanta University. All of his teachers agreed that Du Bois was a strong student ever since he was a child. Um, he was a strong student throughout elementary and middle school and high school. He graduated high school with honors, and his childhood church helped to raise money to cover his tuition so that he was able to attend college. The first university he would attend would be Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. He went on to go on to study at Harvard, becoming just the sixth African American to ever attend Harvard, and as I said, the first ever to receive a doctorate from Harvard. He received a fellowship to study in Berlin at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and he met many German scholars there. Perhaps most notably, he met Max Weber, who we discussed earlier this semester in great detail. Weber was very impressed with Du Bois when he met him, and when Weber would later come to the U.S. For a visit in New England and in parts of the South, he made a point to go see Du Bois once more. Du Bois has the following to say about his time in Germany, saying, quote, "I found myself on the outside of the American world looking in. With me were white folk, students, acquaintances, teachers, who viewed the scene with me. They did not always pause to regard me as a curiosity or something subhuman. I was just a man, of the somewhat privileged student rank, with whom they were glad to meet and talk over the world, particularly the part of the world whence I came." It has been suggested that Du Bois was the first empirical sociologist in the United States. This is not quite true. It's a common misconception. He was one of the early empirical sociologists, however, in the United States. Du Bois was known to be somewhat of an elitist. He liked to separate himself from the what he would consider to be the underclass, as particularly an intellectual underclass. He discussed how a talented tenth are critical to society's achievements, and those who are not in the top 10% of talent, Du Bois thought of as being somewhat lethargic. Du Bois's students considered him to be a brilliant professor, though they also found him to be aloof, elitist, and a bit too strict. He would go on to marry one of his students, Nina, in 1896. Perhaps some of you are already familiar with Du Bois's disagreement with Booker T. Washington, though allow me to reiterate. Booker T. Washington drafted what was known as the Atlantic Compromise, which urged African Americans to accept segregation and to temporarily not pursue equal rights, such as the right to vote. The Atlantic Compromise would make these sacrifices so that African Americans would gain legal protections, access to property ownership, and vocational employment opportunities. Booker T. Washington saw this goal, this sort of compromising goal, as being more realistic for progress in Black America at that time. Du Bois felt that African Americans should fight for full equality rather than compromise, that they shouldn't relegate themselves to vocational opportunities, but rather give themselves access to all the opportunities that white Americans have, and including equal rights such as the right to vote. Booker T. Washington's views with current eyes are not really seen as acceptable or very in tune with the current political and moral moment. That they were seen as a more realistic route for progress at the time that he was espousing these views. As I said on the previous slide, there was a disagreement about education, where Booker T. Washington encouraged African Americans to pursue vocational employment, thinking that was a more realistic path for economic security, whereas Du Bois said that they shouldn't limit themselves to vocational employment, but rather have all opportunities for their education. Humanities, liberal arts, social sciences, etc. have everything on the plate as possibilities for them to pursue their careers and be fully equal with everybody else in society. Despite these disagreements, there was a mutual respect between Du Bois and Washington. A popular biography of Du Bois, if those are interested, came out not too long ago by a sociologist at Northwestern University named Alden Morris. He wrote a book about The Scholar Denied, called The Scholar Denied, rather. In it, he details the ways in which Du Bois did not receive credit for work that he deserved to receive credit for, how his contributions were monumental, though they were sometimes ignored by white sociologists. At the time, sociology was a discipline that was dominated by white men. The American Sociological Association, which started in the very early 1900s, had only white men as their ASA presidents until the 1940s. And it should also be noted that it is not as if the American Sociological Association's birth is when sociology started in America. So, the point is even greater emphasized in terms of that sort of domination of white men. There's another book that actually won the Pulitzer Prize, written by David Lewis. It's a much longer biography, published about 20 years ago. So here are two of the major biographies on Du Bois. Du Bois supported women's rights, such as the right to vote, though he found it difficult to support certain feminist movements in America because they did not show a mutual support. They did not support his rights for African Americans to vote, for example. Some of the early feminists we hear about, although they had noble intentions in some regards, had vile things to say about African Americans in other regards. Some of them were not just mild racists, but eugenicists and white supremacists. They wanted to exclude African Americans from their goals for equality, which they limited to women, and particularly white women. Du Bois's views on eugenics are somewhat ambiguous. He claimed that the most talented members of all races should procreate to result in better quote-unquote stocks of humanity. Although this might not be a preaching of eugenics per se, there's a sort of let's say outdated assumptions about biology embedded here. Du Bois was a socialist and would visit the Soviet Union. He became very influenced by Karl Marx's communism, and he had some similar reservations about religion. Du Bois himself was not religious, and found that Marx's writings about religion being the opium of the people, as we discussed earlier this semester, he thought that this was an apt observation. Although Du Bois was influenced by Marx's form of communism, he would have some disagreements with the Communist Party in the U.S. It's important to cover some of the ugly aspects of Du Bois's life. For example, he was fond of the dictator Mao Zedong. Here, you could see a picture of them meeting in the top right. Um, his views on Joseph Stalin are also somewhat troubling. Although he referred to Joseph Stalin as a tyrant, he also wrote a eulogy after Stalin died, describing him, quote, as simple, calm, and courageous, and lauding him for being the first to set Russia on the road to conquer race prejudice and make one nation out of its 140 groups without destroying their individuality. In his final years, Du Bois would move to Ghana. He died at the age of 95, dying in 1963. Okay, so let us now turn to the first chapter of The Souls of Black Folk. If you didn't pick up on it, I will mention that in the beginning of each chapter, Du Bois has a text from a European poet or thinker, along with a text from a black spiritual. Um, Scholars of Du Bois say that this is done to demonstrate the intellectual and cultural equality between whites and African Americans. This is the first sort of autoethnographic or autobiographical theorizing that we've seen so far this semester, whereas the other theorists we have covered have done a slightly more detached form of technical theorizing. Here we have sort of a self-extension and autobiographical style of theorizing from Du Bois. He starts off by describing this experience of feeling like a problem and how everybody looks at him as if he is a problem. This is, of course, not explicitly stated. He says that that's what they are thinking, and instead of asking him why how it feels to be an existence that can be reduced to a problem, instead they tactfully bring up people of color that they know who they are fond of instead. Probably one of the most important concepts in the souls of black folk, and perhaps even Du Bois' theorizing more generally, is this concept known as double consciousness. We can have a brief description of it at the bottom of page 8, where Du Bois writes, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." So double consciousness is this sort of splitting of oneself to have a self-understanding through your own eyes and through your own understanding, but to also, when one is in a marginalized position in society, to look at oneself through the eyes of those who have a more advantageous position, to look through the eyes of the oppressor. This gives you a sort of double understanding of yourself, resulting in your experience with the world to be doubled, hence double consciousness. He talks about this creating two worlds, two selves, two souls. The Black experience, he says, is characterized by this desire to acquire a self-consciousness and to have one's double self, that which one has when one feels marginalized, into having one unified true self. He goes on from this stating that slavery was long understood as the root of all sorrow and prejudice. He says from the black perspective, so far as the black man thought and dreamed, slavery was indeed the sum of all villainies, the cause of all sorrow, the root of all prejudice, emancipation was the key to a promised land of sweeter beauty than ever stretched before the eyes of wearied Israelites. Then later down the page saying, at last it came, but then later down the page saying, years have passed away since then, that meaning emancipation, 10, 20, 40 years of national life, 40 years of renewal and development, and yet the swarthy spectre sits in its accustomed seat at the nation's feast. So we have this sort of this understanding of the shadow of slavery still casting itself upon the present moment, even if emancipation has occurred. And of course, the shadow persists today, even with the abolition of slavery. He claims that the nation has not overcome its sins, that people may have been freed but don't actually really feel free, etc., etc. He writes, to be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the very bottom of hardships. This is to mean that in such a wealthy nation like the United States, to have the entire race to which you belong be subjected to these hardships is both having aspects of both economic and existential turmoil to it. So he also discusses somewhat in connection to our discussion of the disagreement between him and Booker T. Washington. He writes about the need for education rather than only cooking and serving. He's saying essentially that those who do not see the need for people of color's education see them as half human beings, reducing them to functions that are purely servile. What need of higher culture for half men is quoted on page 13, for example. It is this expectation from the eyes of the oppressor that they should be servants and nothing more. We will now turn to the chapter 5 in Frantz Fanon's Black Skins, White Masks. Like Du Bois, Fanon writes in a sort of autoethnographic way. As he theorizes, he's describing his own personal experiences as well. This is again distinct from, say, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Zimmel, Smith, Comte, Rousseau. All the other theorists we've read so far do not have this type of style. He begins by discussing how he came into the world with a quest for meaning, though that he, quote, burst apart, and the fragments have been put together again by another self. This echoes Du Bois's idea of double consciousness, where one is divided in this exhausting world, and then one is recomposed by your oppressor rather than by yourself. He claims that encounters with white individuals have been an obstacle in his quest for meaning and his quest to recapture himself, which has resulted in a quote-unquote third-person consciousness. He goes on to write about how he is seen as being responsible for not his own individual existence, but for an entire race. This comes with this perception that he belongs to a sort of what we call a collective topology, meaning that his individual existence is subsumed under a sort of collective category. We're going to talk more about this in the next lecture on race and group threat, but it is to be this feeling of being seen not as an individual person, but as a part of a larger abstract categorization where your individualism is represented by your race. There's also these notions of what is referred to as colorism. So although he recognizes that other groups have been marginalized, he brings up Jewish people, he claims that they can pass by the oppressive gaze of the white men because it is not immediately obvious that just upon sight that the Jewish person is a Jewish person, whereas African Americans do not have the same luxury. He writes about being dissected by white eyes, which he refers to as the only real eyes. Of course, not saying only real eyes from the perspective of an oppressive society, a society that gives self-worth to only the oppressor and not to the oppressed. Similar to Du Bois, how Du Bois wrote about how his existence felt as if it was reduced to being perceived as a problem. One's mere being is a problem. Fanon writes about having this feeling that his existence is only subjected to the hatred. The hatred, though, that he describes is not just simply, let's say, somebody down the road who lives from you does not like you, or somebody who goes to school with you really dislikes you. It's not that type of feeling. Instead, it is feeling as if an entire race of people despise you, not because of your individual character, but because of the race to which you belong. He goes on to write about how the white man has had a sort of relationship with the world, which can be punctuated by acquisition, saying that the white man wants to possess the world, exploit the world, and enslave the world for him and for him alone. Fanon then says that the white man has sort of tormented his own soul by doing this, by wanting to merely possess the entire world, that he has become sort of too mechanical and not very human in this process of trying to possess everything and dominate everything in a very greedy way. This sort of habituated mentality has made it the case that when whites, as he says, become too mechanized, they turn to men of color and ask them for a little human sustenance, meaning that the white man does not even feel human anymore, since he is acting in such an oppressive and corrupt manner.